A new Illinois law was signed into action today to add a layer of protection to victims of domestic violence. It's called Karina's Law. It's named after a Chicago woman, Karina Gonzalez, who died from domestic gun violence in 2023. It came weeks after she was granted an order of protection against her husband, Jose, but that husband's firearms owner ID was revoked, and he was still in possession of a gun, and it ultimately led to the shooting of Gonzalez and his teenage daughter. Karina's son, Manny, who was 18 at the time, was also shot but survived.
This is in honor of my mother, Karina Gonzalez, my sister, Daniela Alvarez, and my family, who have had to go through some of the worst pain ever imaginable. But I think what makes us different is that we turn that pain into action, and we hope that this isn't something that someone else has to go through.
Karina's Law will require police to remove firearms no more than 4 days after a search warrant is issued.